Great, cool. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I will just begin by introducing WHIP and the lecture series. So People for Women in Philosophy is a network, that aims to create spaces for women in philosophy. And this lecture series called Theories on Nonviolent Revolutions is meant to be a sort of discussion and investigation into what constitutes revolutions, different histories of revolutions, ways of doing revolution, and just talking a bit more about it, understanding political activism, its history, but also, as it is in the present. We have a lovely panel of speakers today who will be speaking on 18th and 19th century decolonization, like thought as well as movements, and I will introduce the speakers now. So Professor Jared Atting specializes in 19th and 20th century Caribbean literatures and intellectual histories, theories of modernism and modernity in Latin America, and colonial literatures in the Caribbean, with a specific focus on relations between slavery and philosophy. His most recent book is Freedom from Liberation, Slavery, Sentiment, and Literature in Cuba. His current research projects include the Underground Railroad in Central and Western New York and sugar and the modern transatlantic world. Professor Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and the Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American Antiquarian Society for the current academic year. She received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. She taught at the University of Massachusetts for over 20 years, where she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed on faculty. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum, South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015 and featured in the New York Times 1619 project recently. Her second book, the multiple award-winning The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. She's the author and editor of numerous books and articles. She's lectured all over the world and written widely for the mainstream press, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and has been interviewed by the national and international press. A historian of the long 19th century, her research interest lies specifically in the transnational histories of slavery, abolition, and feminism, and the history and legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. She is currently writing a book on the reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, under contract with Liverite. Professor Manuel Garcia is Chair of Global History at University of Leeds. His research focuses on the history of slavery and the slave trade in the 19th century Atlantic world. He's also contributed to the Washington Spectator, the Huffington Post, the Independent, the Daily Telegraph, and Al Jazeera in English. He has been a non-resident fellow at the Hutchins Center's Afro-Latin American Institute at Harvard University and a visiting fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He's currently working on a new project that will examine Western policies to suppress piracy in the 19th century across the world. And Dr. Dexter Peters is Bennett Bosky Fellow in Atlantic History at Exeter College at Oxford. He is interested in the history of the Atlantic world and particularly the cross-imperial relations of the British, Spanish, French, and Dutch Greater Caribbean. His current research project makes a case for the rise of a greater Southern Caribbean region, inclusive of Venezuela and the Guianas, in the late 18th century, showing evidence of a very polyglot, cross-imperial, and interconnected world. He also taught me about the Haitian Revolution last time, and that was wonderful. So the way this is going to work is I just have in mind that the speakers will just start off with some opening remarks and then, a conversation between everyone on the panel. And then the last 30 minutes we'll leave for audience Q&As. So an hour for the panel and then half an hour for audience Q&As. That works, everyone. And yeah, I guess you could just start, whoever wants to go first can start us off. I maybe should have thought out like an order, but you guys can decide amongst yourselves.
Should we just go in the order you introduced us, Ruthie? So maybe Gerard can go first?
Yeah, this is what I was thinking. So if everybody's in agreement with that, thank you. Thank you very much for having organized this, Shruti, this transatlantic event. I'm very happy to be there, very interested in knowing about the work of the People for Women in Philosophy group. So I congratulate the group in also sponsoring this. And I'm very happy to be with my co-panelists here today. I'm going to share the screen for a second and let you know, I hope everybody could see this clearly. And so following on the theme of nonviolent revolutions, I just wanted to present a bit of what I am beginning to do, the kind of comparative work that I'm trying to do. And so the title that I had for this was The Ends of Compromise, meaning both at the end of a compromise where it no longer functions, ends of compromise, meaning the motives that would generate compromise. And I'm thinking of two places because I had done work on Cuba in the last book, Freedom from Liberation, and I'm currently in a part of the United States, central New York, which had many of the routes of the Underground Railroad. So I was asked by the Latin American Studies program to sort of think of both. And what I did come up with was to sort of look at this particular period, 1830 to 1850. And, and this is just some basic information for those who may not be as familiar. And I think, of course, my co-panelists are very familiar with this information, and it's just for the audience to have a sense of what I'll be, mentioning today. The central question for the comparison for me is, what is the impact of slavery's dehumanization on a society's social and political institutions? And I'm specifically thinking about the tolerance that a society would have for dehumanization, in this case, anti-Black racialization, right? So the tolerance that a society would have for that. And the reason I'm thinking in terms of tolerance is just to be thinking about the sort of compromise in the case of 1850 that produced the Fugitive Slave Act. In the case of Central and Western New York, right? So the idea that I had was to be thinking about the impact of the Underground Railroad on the fugitive slave law. There were so many of the runaways leaving the South, especially just south of the Mason-Dixon line, that it did impact the debate about the fugitive slave law in that compromise that included other compromises. So, it's all well and good to look back and say that the compromise didn't work, but I don't think that's a fair thing to say. Just thinking about we know that that's what happened historically, but at the moment of the debate, it becomes very interesting to see what were the sort of alibis that people had, in terms of going along with the passage of the fugitive slave law. So that becomes, what are the ends of compromise in that sense? And just thinking about the case of the Escalera conspiracy in 1844, we're not speaking of compromise here at all. We're just speaking, and in that sense, the end of even the possibility of compromise is when you have, the colonial authorities through a conspiracy that we still don't know the exact number of people who were tortured and killed here. But one of the ways in which the colonial authorities handled the situation, that was a very tense situation where you had the reformists of enslavement, very much more like the manumission society in the United States, right? It was that particular class. It was also with, thinking of a sort of a gradual manumission. British abolitionists in the region, not that there was an abolitionist movement within Cuba itself, that was, obviously not allowed under the colonial authorities. And there were some of the reformists who were interested in annexation to the United States. And of course, there were slaves who were well aware of what had happened in Haiti, right? And free Blacks and mulattoes who were beginning to form a petty bourgeoisie, right? That and so had a sort of the beginnings of an economic clout. and at some point would have been asking for political rights as well. So this was the sort of cauldron that was happening in the 1840s. And so the colonial authorities, sort of clamped down on these contingent possibilities, these strategies, by thinking about a conspiracy. And it's interesting that the escalator refers to the ladder on which tortured bodies were tied and whipped and so on. So the conspiracy doesn't have the name of someone, right? It has the name of the method that was used, to get people to confess that there had been a conspiracy. But this is one way in which that possibility of something revolutionary wasn't allowed to happen. So in both cases, in this case, what has been interesting for me is to see this as the revolution that did not happen, and obviously just thinking of there are more of those than there are of the revolutions that we cite, right? So that was of interest to me, but also to compare it, to compare that with the case of the United States, in which certain institutions are challenged, by this debate about the Underground Railroad and the fugitive slave law. And so this is not the case of something revolutionary, but we know that the debate was one in which it was important to try and, there was an appeasement going on to keep the southern states within the Union, right? And we know that all of this sort of fell apart as the whole situation moved to civil war. So in both cases, these are internal conflicts, right? In the case of Cuba and in the United States. And this is what I'm bringing to the table, to be able to think about that question of the tolerance that, in the case of the United States, it's democratic, political institutions, the tolerance it would have for dehumanization, the dehumanization of slavery. And in the case of Cuba, the clear sort of authoritarian might with which any chance to be thinking about, abolition or manumission was not permitted at all. So one is clearly a colonial, environment, and the other one is an independent, nation within the Americas. So let me stop there. Thanks.
So, sorry, go ahead, Shruti.
No, I was just about to say that you're good to go if you want.
Great. Thank you, Shruti, for having us and for that introduction, and Gerard for your presentation. I am going to be sharing my screen with you also. So hopefully this should work. Can you see it? All right. So what I decided to do today was to really reevaluate the relationship between the abolition movement and imperialism and decolonization. The common narrative, especially of British abolition, is that abolition was a precursor to imperialism, especially in Africa, and that the British state literally acquired the moral capital of abolition in order to actually conquer and divide the rest of the world, over seeing them as societies which needed to be saved, civilized, and where slavery needed to be abolished. So in my book, The Slave Scores, which I'm going to give you a very short, brief rundown of this argument. So if you're interested, feel free to go have a look at the book, especially the chapter on the Abolitionists International that reevaluates the relationship between abolition and imperialism. And the basic argument that I'm making here is that when we see abolition as a precursor to British imperialism, especially, and European imperialism in general, we are really talking about the state. We are not talking about the social movement that was abolition. And in the book, what I try to do is reimagine abolition as a radical interracial social movement that included, men and women, blacks and whites, and one in which African Americans, and particularly slave resistance to slavery played a central part. And if you think of abolition in that way, then one has to, in fact, reconsider the relationship between abolition and European imperialism. And so the book really begins with centering the ways in which African Americans resisted slavery through, rebellions, through running away, which of course led to the fugitive slave controversy that Gerard referred to, and also, suing for their freedom. And I know Manuel's going to be talking about that, so I won't talk too much about it. But I will really begin with talking about a revolution, the Haitian Revolution, which was not just an abolitionist revolution, it was also an anti-imperialist revolution. This was an argument that C.L.R. James first made, and that many historians today have recovered and deepened our understanding of the revolution, despite all the different factions, the Europeans, the divisions between the enslaved and the free sort of gentlemen of color, etc. We really understood the Haitian Revolution as the first example of a successful slave rebellion that led to the establishment of the first modern Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think if we understand the Haitian Revolution as an abolitionist revolution, and that is something that most abolitionists were actually quite aware of. Thomas Clarkson wrote a defense of slave rebellion because of the Haitian Revolution at the very start of the revolution. And in the United States, in 1804 already, Black and white abolitionists are commemorating the founding of Haiti as a successful example of both abolition and decolonization. And that is something that is often lost in our understanding of Haiti because of the subsequent poverty and political instability aggravated by European policies. And so that is a facet of the revolution that I really wanted to recover in the book, is the abolitionist reaction to it. And they clearly saw it as a milestone in the history of abolition, coming after the gradual emancipation laws in the United States in the North. But they see this as a far more important example of decolonization and revolutionary abolition than even that process of gradual emancipation in the United States. So in recovering the sort of relationship between abolition and European imperialism in the book, I discovered many other incidents and many other movements with which abolition overlapped, and which really revealed its radical sort of counter-imperialist nature, if I could put it that way. And so I was really arguing, again, I'm still arguing against the grain in terms of understanding British abolition as I know it is in the literature. So you begin with the ways in which abolition starts overlapping very soon with other contemporary radical social movements. And one of them was, of course, utopian socialism. In the 1830s and 1840s, you had both Black and white abolitionists who are pictured here. George Benson, who was the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's brother-in-law, David Ruggles, who forms is one of the most influential figures, I should say, in the New York Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad that really advocated resistance to the fugitive slave laws. And of course, Sojourner Truth, who married her beliefs in utopian socialism, feminism, abolitionism, in taking part in this abolitionist experiment in utopian socialism in Northampton, Massachusetts, what Christopher Clark has famously called the Communitarian Moment. So this notion that abolitionists were like, a white middle class, a northern bourgeoisie. I mean, it's just, it flies in the face of the actual evidence, because of course abolitionists are experimenting with, at this time, many different kinds of ideas, and utopian socialism is one of them, and I'm just giving you this one example. The abolition movement also tended to overlap with the labor movement, the early labor movement. Again, the conventional understanding is that there's a lot of conflict between abolitionists and the early labor movement, and that is not necessarily true. Especially the Garrisonians are very aware of the Chartist movement, tend to support most of its demands. Garrison writes his first critiques of early capitalism after visiting Britain and seeing what he saw as the depredations of industrial capitalism. But more importantly, there were other Garrisonians besides Garrison himself who are extremely important, who call themselves socialist abolitionists, because they were so interested in the idea of addressing the plight of labor, of the working classes. The most important one of these was William Henry Channing, who actually organized several conventions with the labor movement and the abolition movement together, arguing that the interests of abolitionists, that the freedom of Black labor was not antagonistic to white labor, that in fact this was overlapping, something of course that Marx also says in Das Kapital by saying that there can be no labor movement in the United States as long as labor in Black skin remains enslaved. And they hadn't read that at that point, it hadn't been written even, but these abolitionists are pretty much arguing the same idea. And then there were others like Parker Pillsbury and Stephen Foster, known as radical abolitionists from New Hampshire, who were also, making this argument. Pillsbury, of course, had been a Teamster himself. Many of them were from working class origins and really wanted to address this idea that somehow abolitionists were shedding crocodile tears over the plight of the slave while they remained blind to the oppressions of the working classes in their own backyard. That was a favorite argument of slaveholders, and one that has found quite a lot of favor amongst recent historians, but I would argue is, again, flies in the face of the evidence. Then there were, of course, a sort of an infusion of a lot of radical European ideas about revolution into the abolition movement after the European revolutions of 1848. Many of these men were extremely central in arguing for the importance of linking abolition with the cause of republican government, with the cause of democracy in the European world. You will recognize most of these famous men: Mazzini from Italy, of course, Schellcher from France, and Karl Heinzen from Germany, who had been a compatriot actually of Marx. Heinzen actually immigrated to the United States, and he was part of that whole group of German Americans who fought for the Union and who were extremely radical in their ideas about both political and economic democracy. Finally, I got the direct link that I had been kind of looking for in my research when I looked at many British anti-imperialists and the ways in which they had been connected with the abolition movement and their influence on American abolitionists. A very prominent person in this is George Thompson, and he, of course, does become a very important ally of Garrison. Many of these men were very critical of British rule in India in particular. George Thompson had even visited India. And I started seeing the names of early Indian nationalists and social reformers, not common names, people like Dwarkanath Tagore, who was the father of Rabindranath Tagore, popping up in abolitionist papers and abolitionist meetings in Britain. And then I saw abolitionists selling locks of hair of Raja Rammohun Roy, who was an Indian nationalist and reformer, in the Boston Anti-Slavery Bazaar, the way they sold Wilberforce's locks of hair. So that fascinated me, that why would they do this? And were people even aware of this? What was more interesting, of course, was the ideological critique. So after the 1857 revolt in India in particular, I read abolitionist reactions to the British suppression of that revolt and the formal transfer of India into sort of British imperial governance. And what was interesting for me to find was they kept reading all the stories of native cruelty from the British press. And Garrison said, this looks a lot at the way in which Americans react to slave rebellions. And they started listing all the oppressions of the Indian people under the East India Company and later on British rule. So all that was important for me to look. And of course, there were these important Quakers who, Quaker abolitionists who were part of the British India Society, who were very critical of British rule in India, who also influenced Garrison. In fact, he named one of his daughters after one of them. And the last example is that, of course, of Alfred Webb, who was the son of the Irish abolitionist Richard Webb. He was actually elected as the president of a Indian National Congress convention, honorary president of the Indian National Congress in India in the 1890s. So that connection between anti-imperialism and Indian nationalists continued. And, you know, it was, of course, fascinating for me because most American historians who are probably not very familiar with the names of those Indian nationalists had ignored all that when it came up to them in the abolitionist print culture. Finally, I looked also the ways in which abolitionists critiqued settler colonialism in the United States and how they tried to link the conquest and dispossession of Native Americans with the fight against slavery and for Black rights and citizenship in the United States, sort of really imagining broadly an interracial democracy. And really important in this quest was Lydia Maria Child, who of course wrote one of the first pamphlets against racism and appeal on behalf of that class of Americans whom we call Africans, and her husband, David Child. They wrote critiques of both the extermination and dispossession of Native Americans, Lydia Maria Child and her novels, David Lee Child more formally. Then, of course, Joshua Giddings, who was a radical Republican, one of the founders of the original Republican Party, not to be confused with the one today, which was an anti-slavery party. He wrote a history of the Seminole Wars, in which he looked at the connections between runaway slaves to the Seminole Indian Nation. And finally, during Reconstruction, Black politicians, Republican politicians like Blanche K. Bruce, brought up continually the plight of Native Americans while they were simultaneously fighting for their own rights in the post-war South. So again, this connection sort of continued even in the post-Civil War era and became more acute because of the conquest of the Plains Indians in the late 19th century. I also wanted to show you this because it's an English audience. This is Raja Rammohun Roy's grave in England. In Bristol, England. Not many people are aware of it, but he was actually buried in England and buried actually by his abolitionist friends. And most Indians don't know about this, and many people studying British abolition also don't know that his grave was actually paid for by British abolitionists and made actually in an Indian temple style. You can see, I just thought that would be a nice curiosity to put in there. Now, the other way in which abolitionists developed an anti-imperialist critique is by joining the international peace movement. Most Black abolitionists like James W.C. Pennington and William Wells Brown, who actually spent a lot of time in England in the 1850s, both of them fugitive slaves themselves, always argued that slavery was a state of war against Black people. And therefore, when you talk about pacifism, it was really important first to address the issue of slavery than simply wars between nations. Other, British and American abolitionists like Joseph Sturge and William Jay argued that militarism was an important aspect of imperialism and the ways in which European nation states both fought against each other and acquired colonies, again, linking their commitments to the peace movement to abolition. Interestingly enough, in the United States, once the Civil War started, many ardent pacifists like Garrison put their anti-slavery principles before pacifism. So their revolutionary commitment to abolition before pacifism, and are all, they want to go and they support the war, they support the Union war effort, and they want, in fact, the South to lose and lose horribly, and to literally smite out slavery the John Brown way. So interestingly now, when it actually comes to choosing between these principles, they actually choose abolition. I'm going to finally leave you with an abolitionist portrait from the United States, which shows, I think, the nature of the movement. This is the executive committee of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society that included men and women, blacks and whites. And in a way, abolitionists tried to do that. They tried to create a democratic and alternative space that had its tensions, both along the axes of race and gender, but one which was always out in the open and being challenged and debated. And I simply don't have enough time to talk about that. Would be happy to address it during the question answer session. But I'd just like to leave you with an idea, and that is that if we look at decolonization and anti-imperialist movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, we really need to look at the abolition movement, and particularly at the role of Black men and women within that movement. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Manisha. We'll get on to questions first, but that was a fascinating presentation. So thank you. But Manuel, if you want to go next.
Thank you very much, Rudy, and thanks to your group as well, and to my fellow panelists. I'm actually delighted that there is even a Q&A here. It's never, it's never bad to have somebody who works one's country. Right, I'm going to be talking about resistance, not rebellions. I'm going to try to keep it short. Usually when we think about resistance, and we think about slave resistance in particular, we normally think about rebellions. But of course, the range of actions of resistance is much wider than that. However, historians have focused over the years, historians have focused mostly on violent actions, or one way or another. So we're talking, yes, rebellions, but also suicides or marronage. These have been by far and away the forms of resistance that historians have focused on over the years. I want to talk here about the non-violent form of resistance, which are just as important as the violent forms. And again, precisely because of that focus on violent forms of resistance, they have been somehow dismissed. They have been considered to be sort of irrelevant, and often this irrelevancy is attached also to what I would call a lack of political content. There are people who have actually gone as far as arguing that forms of resistance without the political content really don't matter that much. So of course, revolutions have taken the lion's share of these studies, and rebellion. I have myself felt a victim of this trend. I wrote extensively about rebellions in my career. But I really think that it's important to discuss these non-violent forms of resistance, because first of all, based on the information that we have, they are effective. In reality, they have been transformational in many, or they were transformational in many slave societies. I have really never seen them as a manifestation of acquiescence, which is an accusation that is often leveled against everyday resistance or nonviolent resistance. And I think that precisely because they rely on mutuality, they rely on people trusting each other to be able to carry them forward, or in other cases, they rely on anonymity, which makes finding them in the historical sources more difficult. They actually manage to have an impact on the ways in which slave societies across the Americas evolved throughout the colonial period and the imperial period in the case of Brazil. So I basically wanted to mention a few and close with a few minor remarks. So I think that one that jumps out of the page, and I think that it's being already mentioned by Gerard here, is, for instance, the way in which slaves are going to be able to make use of the legal framework of each slave society in which they are embedded. So, for instance, manumission is a classic case of through which the enslaved are able to resist both enslavement and slavery. And I think that this is an important distinction to be made here. One thing is enslavement, another is enslavement as a condition, and another thing is slavery as a system. But I actually think that both the opportunities to attain freedom by buying it, which is an opportunity that is given to enslaved, or the slave could take advantage of in many slave societies in the Americas, is a very important one, which has been really picked up by historians in the past 10, 15, 20 years. And it's becoming more and more relevant to see how transformational the use of the law, of the very laws that they were supposed to be there to govern enslaved populations, they are going to be exploited by the enslaved precisely to subvert these systems. Another way of using the law as well, of course, and this is not always possible, but in many cases, the accusations against abusive masters, against abusive authorities as well, are going to make it all the way to the courts, and through these accusations, we can actually, to a certain extent, even get a glimpse of what the enslaved had to say, and their voice actually jumps out of the page. So that's one thing. I wanted to mention also that there are multiple ways of disguise physical resistance, which is not necessarily violent. Sabotage is the one that jumps out immediately. And enslaved almost everywhere in the Americas, they set up infrastructure on fire whenever they could. They destroy crops. They carry out all sorts of different ways of slow working, food dragging, feigning illness, breaking tools, doing things wrong. There were many ways of subverting the system through this kind of forms. For women, even the use of the body could be interpreted as a form of resistance, how they were able to resist the power using their bodies. And also we have other forms, like for instance, peaceful demonstrations were common across the slave systems in the Americas throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th century. We have multiple demonstrations or strikes, if you want, of the enslaved demanding better working conditions or better living conditions, or some facilities that they didn't have. So that I think that this is important to add here as well. And finally, we have also cultural forms of resistance, which again are often left aside, but they are central to understand how day-to-day life and day-to-day resistance is going to take place in these spaces. So for instance, gossip, jokes, even gestures, the use of languages that the oppressors could not understand because of languages coming from Africa, originally from Africa, they are all going to form part of this arsenal of cultural forms of resistance. And also religious practice, cultural practices that they can be, or they could be singing, dancing, playing drums that sometimes were used to convey messages, gambling, etc., etc. So to close, I really wanted to be brief. I think that the first thing that we need to make sure here is that not because forms of resistance were not violent, we should consider them as manifestations of acquiescence to power. This is an oversimplification in my opinion. The second one is that almost any forms of resistance, whether they were violent or non-violent, they serve to undermine, to weaken, to subvert the systems and the structures of oppression as well. And finally, in many ways, they were actually precursors of violent forms of resistance. Many revolutions, and again, Gerard was mentioning the La Escalera in Cuba, many of these slave movements that are eventually going to turn into violent movements, they are going to go through a process of what people call conspiracy or plotting, where people talk, where people organize, where people do things within the safety of their private spaces, and they do so in what is at the time a non-violent forms of resistance. So I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to talk too much because we're running out of time, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mara. That was really interesting. I've got a few things that I'd like to bring up about that, but yeah, thanks. Now over to you.
Thank you, Shruti. All right, let me share my screen really quickly, so I can. Okay, that looks about right. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the participation in politics of people of color in the late 18th and early 19th century. Of course, I'm a historian of the Greater Caribbean largely, and I mean, just to sort of briefly talk about what that region is, I think primarily sort of concerned with the institution of slavery. That's how it's sort of been conceptualized over time. And I mean, which essentially means a region that can span from Brazil all the way to, say, Virginia. And I think part of what I want to highlight here is the way in which the Greater Caribbean sort of developed as a sort of trans-imperial, sort of integrated, interconnected sort of region. So, for example, you have the development of sort of slave laws, say in Barbados, that then kind of get replicated in Jamaica and South Carolina. So that's just the kind of emphasis of the way in which the slavery was sort of very much kind of interconnected. And in the same way, sort of similar kind of governing institutions. So across the British Caribbean, for example, you have the development of these legislative assemblies, so to speak, planter assemblies as they're called. And essentially in places where there was sort of a significant scale of slavery, where you have sort of white planters becoming a significant percentage of the kind of ruling class elites in society, so to speak, and really sort of dominating the political realm. So in some sense, my focus on people of color and their sort of participation in the kind of political realm is a form of resistance, so to speak. And I'm saying that I'm thinking about sort of Jeremy Edelman's. Here's an article on the age of imperial revolutions, and he's talking about not just sort of looking at revolutions as sort of an inevitable kind of rise to nation states, but the way in which these revolutions can be considered as a period of reconstituting empire, of, you know, sort of reforming to make things work better. And that's sort of something that I kind of considered driven out from kind of metropolitan areas. But thinking about how people of color also sought to participate in the kind of reform of empire as well, I think is an interesting aspect to focus on. And so I am just going to talk very, very briefly today about two ways that free people, not free people, but people of color generally, because I'm also including enslaved persons as well. Two ways in which they kind of participated in politics. One would be looking at petitions, and then I'll move on to looking a bit at sort of collective action. Because, I mean, enslaved persons, newly freed Africans, they made increasing use of petitions during the Revolutionary era. So in Saint Domingue, for example, newly freed enslaved persons regularly took to petitioning their de facto leader, Toussaint Louverture, after emancipation in Saint Domingue. So in 1799, for example, a group of former enslaved persons from the parish of Petite Rivière petitioned Louverture, indicating their refusal to work until the release of a popular military commander from prison, evidenced by the existence of a Haitian Creole document. And free people of color, of course, made significant use of petitioning on the road to securing political rights in the late 18th century. And a lot of that is sort of well known in the literature or scholarship around the Haitian Revolution. We know of Julian Rammohun, for example, and his significant sort of way in which he participated in a kind of petition movement. I believe the petition I have to the right here is one from Julian Rammohun as well. And the way in which that also led to, because again, I started off by talking about this kind of trans-imperial experience. And so from the late 18th century, we see a significant increase in petitioning across the board. So there are petitioning movements that develop not just in Saint-Domingue, but in the French Caribbean, across the British Caribbean, and we even see it occurring in the Danish Caribbean as well. So for example, in 1823, and this is sort of 1790s, the early 1800s, so up to 18 teens, tens, and so on. There's significant scale of petitions movements occurring, and culminating all the way up to into the 1820s, where, so in 1823, free Jamaicans of color organized the first island-wide petition for improved rights, including the right to vote in elections. Some 3,000 persons signed the petition. It was ultimately sort of rejected, but this kind of widespread mobilization essentially sort of empowered people of color. And so that's thinking briefly about petitions. I'll talk very, very briefly about sort of collective action as well, because the popular petitioning sort of went hand in hand with the development of groups, societies, associations, clubs that sought to influence colonial politics. So I talked about Julian Rammohun before, and he participated in the development of the Society of American Colonists, made up of people of color in France, who were sort of lobbying for equal rights. And they kind of facilitated these petition movements and facilitated sort of the lobbying of officials in metropolitan France. And very similarly, to mention this example in Jamaica in 1823, part of the facilitation of the first island-wide petition campaign, they did that through the establishing of a committee of correspondence to organize this island-wide campaign. And they not only sent circulars to spread information, but they also sort of sought to solicit the views of people, and they organized public gatherings across several parishes. The results of these efforts was a petition that now not only represented the wishes of a few, but of a kind of a wider cross-section of people of color, and also making some more sort of sophisticated arguments for equal rights. And then I think just very briefly to think about the role of enslaved persons as well. One thing that and I guess this is kind of coming off what Manuel was saying in terms of thinking about nonviolent forms of resistance, but thinking about marriage and grand marriage in particular. And we know the famous case of Jamaica, for example, where there were autonomous sort of maroon communities that emerged that also helped to participate and they participated in colonial politics to the extent to which peace treaties were signed. And they would continue to sort of petition the Colonial Assembly in Jamaica for different conditions or different things over time. And because of this sort of threat that they posed to the slave system, their concerns were always sort of addressed, if not always appeased, but certainly addressed in the colonial assemblies. And so I think this is also thinking about maroon societies as sort of autonomous communities, even sort of outside of the realm of colonial politics, with a kind of separate zone of politics, is another way of thinking about the participation of enslaved persons in a kind of political realm, sort of even shaping their own realm, so to speak. So I think that's important. And then, I'm just kind of wrapping up here in terms of thinking about slave revolts. And we know of these slave revolts sort of being connected from the late 18th century on, as almost a participation or helping to sort of shape and influence political debates and so on. So, for the Haitian Revolution and also in Martinique, these rumors of, the king granting, an amelioration of conditions or something, or increased days off, and connecting that to the early 19th century emancipation revolts, which often sort of were connected to rumors, either rumors of improvements or rumors of complete sort of slave emancipation, and that kind of driving action. So much so that in Martinique, when slave emancipation was granted, this is the second time around after Napoleon. they sort of delayed the implementation of this, and that led to a very widespread slave revolt to ensure that they were completely freed. And I think the governor sort of implemented it the day after. And so these are just ways of thinking about how enslaved persons actively sort of participated in politics. And I think it's an interesting link to make with slave revolts. I think with that, yeah, just thinking about sort of two main ways that people of color participated in politics in the colonial empires. During this sort of age of revolution. So things kind of occurring alongside all these significant moments of the period. But these are ways in which, again, kind of subtle ways, I think, that they sort of resisted a slave system that was meant, or a political realm that was meant to exclude people of color entirely. And the ways in which they sort of made encroachments into that system is interesting to look at. So with that, I think I will pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think if like the panelists have questions for one another, go for it. But also people in the audience, either like, you know, pop your question in the chat if you'd rather I just speak it to the panelists, but also, you know, either just put me or raise your hand and I will ask you know, you to put your questions. But for now, if anyone in the panel has questions for one another and their presentation. Yeah, Declan, go for it.
Yeah, I can just shoot off two quick questions. I think one is to go back to the point you're making, Manisha, about sort of the kind of the Haitian Revolution being sort of the first significant anti-imperial revolution. And I guess this connects to Manuel as well. And I wondered the extent to which we can think about moments before the Haitian Revolution as being sort of anti-imperialist. And I'm thinking about, I know Vincent Brown's recent book, Untitled, and he's talking about shaping that rebellion as a sort of slave war, a race war, a slave war, and in ways in which we can sort of think about that as anti-imperialist. And then even thinking about sort of Hilary Beckel's concept of the 200-year slave war. And again, that ties into issues of sort of non-violent slave resistance as well, and a way in which we can frame the entire period as being sort of, you know, either sort of a slave war, or to some extent anti-imperialist as well. So I thought I'd put that out there. And a quick question for, I think Jared, but I think it can be across the board, is because you talked about, both Jared and Manisha talked about this sort of, you know, the development of cross-sectional movements. You know, so I think, Jared, you're talking about sort of those in support of US annexation, people of color, enslaved persons, and so on. And I think there's something about this sort of cross-sectional movement that leads to significant development in society. And even if, you know, as you said, Jared, it doesn't necessarily lead to a sort of widespread revolution. To what extent does this sort of cross-sectional mobilization shift, you know, yeah, what's the consequence of that in society, political institutions? How are they sort of shaping interactions, political culture, and so on? So yeah, two broad questions.
Great question, Drexnell, because you know, clearly one can see slave resistance. You know, if you see slave resistance in all its forms as constitutive of abolition, as you can see the anti-imperial strain in anti-slavery efforts, whether it's grassroots Black politics or influencing, you know, social movement politics, even at a higher level, right? You can see how that reverberates through the system. That's why when I began my book, I began actually with maroon communities in the west coast of Africa, and with a slave rebellion on a shipboard slave rebellion. So you can see that, I think, from the very inception of the slave trade and slavery, you know, we become so used to narratives of African participation in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, that we've forgotten the origins of anti-slavery in West African resistance strategies to enslavement, by European powers. So I would completely agree. You could go further back from even Taki's revolt to make that argument. And then looking forward to the 19th century, you mentioned the Demerara slave revolt, and the first woman abolitionist who calls for immediate, not gradual abolition. She writes this pamphlet on it, and she challenges Wilberforce and some of the more conservative abolitionists on this. And people just wonder, why is she doing this? And you go to the end of her pamphlet, it's all about the Demerara slave rebellion. So you can see how the rise of Black militancy, both in terms of rebellions and in as you point out, free Blacks demanding rights, whether it is Rammohun in Saint Domingue, or Robert Wedderburn in Britain, or David Walker in the United States. You can see this movement. So I would definitely agree with you and say that all forms of slavery, certainly predating even the Haitian Revolution, even marriage within Haiti before the Haitian Revolution, right? So you can definitely say, the only reason why I specify the Haitian Revolution, because it's a case of successful decolonization. So in that sense, I think we don't think of it as a precursor to decolonization in the late 20th century. But if you think about it, the Haitian Revolution is definitely an example of that. And it's a better example of it than the American Revolution, which after all was not a completely abolitionist revolution. It created a nation half slave and half free. So I think Haiti, actually, we forget it in that genealogy, in that particular. But I would agree with you, all forms of slave resistance would count in my book as anti-imperial, anti-slavery resistance. So I'll let
yeah, one of the things that fascinates me about those moments, those sort of, what Dexnell just identified as those sort of cross-sectional movements and conflicts. It's because you get a particular moment when there's a sort of, I use the word contingency, right? Sort of these movements coming into contact. And because you get to the complexity when there is not yet a definite political content, in the way that Manuel had mentioned, the whole question, when Manuel was saying sometimes the bias against non-violent resistance has been that there's been, no sort of political content attached to it in the beginning. So before you have a specific political content, by that I mean a way of reading the revolution or the resistance, right? You have these contingencies when you don't know what's going to come out of that moment, right? And so all the different forms of resistance become important, right? So the ones that were mentioned in terms of the ones that happen sort of culturally and, in a mundane way on the plantation, right? Anywhere in plantation America, right? Or, sort of access to the legal sort of instruments available, marronage, all of these other things begin to come to the foreground once they have a particular, sort of political sort of content. Eventually, we tend to go back to the Haitian Revolution, C.L.R. James's text, and I think in a way we see the complexity there as well, because he did such an excellent job at looking at sort of the class, sort of conflicts, but also the racial conflicts that were attached to that. And he clearly gives it a straightforward political content of how he's reading, the Haitian Revolution, both in the 1930s, thinking about African sort of movements, as well as, the 1860s, thinking about, Castro and the role of Cuba to the Caribbean and Latin America. So he's clearly upfront about the political content, but he still leaves these moments, where you get him, it's fascinating when he cites the whole sort of letter coming from General Leclerc, who was sent over, right, to take back Haiti, where General Leclerc is saying, please send some more, recruits. And he says, we do not know we have an erroneous idea of the Negro in Europe, right? He states that because he's pointing out these are the people that we have to find. And he gives examples of the ways in which they resist, right, in the middle of this confrontation. Granted, that's within the revolutionary moment as well, but we also get, you know, a clear sense that, you know, we have to ask ourselves, you know, the motives for Toussaint Louverture wanting to remain, you know, within the French Empire, right, at the same time. So, I mean, these are moments, these are complex moments that come up when things haven't been set yet as having apolitical content for us to understand it as a revolution, you know. So looking back at these moments, we are thinking of, you know, we're able to think about what if the possibilities would have been there if, you know, why wasn't that allowed? And so when you have something like a authoritarian sort of colonial government clamps down on it, you begin to see those dangerous points for the whole structure, right, that they're pointing out as needing to be eliminated. So I think the whole question of, okay, if there is no political content, what are we left with? You know, what are the elements that add to the resistance? You know, and it gives us a chance to sort of examine them more closely.
I think on that note, you know, like, you know, to do with this idea of nonviolent actions not being inherently political, Stella Datsy has just written this book. You know, she was a great, like, feminist organizer, and, you know, she's done phenomenal work. But she's written this book called A Kick in the Belly, and she, you know, like, one of the things she argues is that a lot of the time enslaved women would, you know, carry with them the knowledge from, you know, like African traditional medicines of how to induce abortions, but also induce abortions within themselves in order to not participate in this, you know, structure of actually producing, you know, enslaved children. And I just thought that was a really interesting point, with like Manuel also talking about how women, you know, like their side, like their bodies were a site of resistance as well. And, you know, that is true for, you know, like men as well, in different ways, but yeah.
Glad you spoke about, sorry, I'm glad you spoke about the gender dimensions of enslaved resistance, because I think that is important to remember. In fact, what's interesting in the US is that many of the initial freedom suits came from women, came particularly from African-American women. So I had a question for Manuel, actually. I was really fascinated by your presentation and this concept of using law as an instrument for liberation, right, for enslaved people. And I'm thinking of, you know, I just found so many instances of that in the US case, going right back to the colonial era, and sort of ending with Dred Scott, ironically enough, which said that Black people are not citizens. But that was an old tradition here. And I was just wondering, Manuel, if you would talk a little bit about how you see this a little theoretically, because, you know, here are people of African descent taking advantage of colonial legal systems in order to claim rights and make freedom claims, right? And on the other hand, you have this notion of how the law can be hegemonic, even when it gives concessions, it reinforces its own legitimacy in the eyes of, you know, so I was just wondering, you know, how it was something that I struggled with, you know, how to navigate that a little bit, because in the US case, they are constantly evoking the protections of English common law to make freedom claims, to assert rights. And I was wondering how you were thinking about that in the Cuban context.
Well, actually, across the Americas, and as a matter of fact, there are quite a few important issues here. Is that some territories in the Americas, they are going to resort to customary law, which means that there is not a written law to deal with the things. There is a custom, and others they have actually proper codes. They have what scholars or contemporaries call black codes or slave codes, in which these rules were codified, including rights. Now, I know very little about anything in this world apart from the 19th century. So I'm focusing here on the 19th century, late 18th century and 19th century. So when the 19th century comes into existence, there are already a few codes of rules and customary laws in different places that actually grant concessions to the enslaved to claim certain rights. And now these rights are minimal. These rights are very limited, but as you say very precisely, they are going to legitimize slave systems as the ones, even those who are trying to take advantage of this law have to recognize, have to acknowledge that these systems also benefit them, and they are legitimizing them by using them. I do think that there is one important difference in how the enslaved use the law. I am not a specialist on this. I have written about this, but this is not my neck of the woods. But I really think that there is a main difference here that needs to be highlighted, and it's the difference between Creoles and African-born, specifically African-born enslaved people who had spent short periods or who in the Americas, or who have been sent to remote plantations where interactions with the local languages, be Portuguese, Dutch, English, French, whatever, was limited. So they were not able to learn the languages, and even less they are going to be able to figure out that there is a law in that country that may benefit them. So if you look at scholars who have worked on this across America, people like Mary Karash and Kayla Greenberg from Brazil, or you look at Alejandro de la Fuente and Rebecca Scott and Ariela Gross for the south of the United States and Cuba, or you have people like Stinchcomb for the British Caribbean, they all have come to the same conclusions. The slave system, they actually provide different avenues, but also the background of who is looking for these benefits is important. For instance, to put it in a way that people can understand it a bit better, in Brazil, in the 19th century, Creole woman has more, a Creole woman who was enslaved had many more chances, especially if she lives in an urban environment, had many more chances of accessing these laws and these opportunities than an African woman from Africa. But it was even worse if you were more precise, and you would say there was a Creole woman from a Yoruba descent living in an urban center, let's say Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, as opposed to an African man from a Bantu origin living on a plantation, say in the Paraíba Valley. So the difference is really, you can actually take the two extremes and show how much different the experience of a Creole woman of Yoruba descent in Rio de Janeiro was from the opportunities that a Bantu man living in a countryside in a plantation in the Paraíba Valley had to access the law. First of all, this man didn't speak the language, he didn't know the laws, was isolated in a faraway place. So the law, obviously, even though these provisions are there, they are not for everybody either. We cannot assume, because this is the trap Tannenbaum fell in, is that you cannot assume that things are homogeneous across the board, that because there is a law, people can use the law. This doesn't work like that. It's just not like that. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that here or there where you are.
That's a great point. It's a lot like then, I'm thinking of Bianca Primo's work on Mexico, right? It's similar. They make these claims based on very particular identities, as you put it, Creole, etc. If I may, I had one question for Drexel, actually. May I ask it? So I really loved your conception of Black politics, that there is a sphere of politics at the grassroots that is sort of unique and different than, let's say, the sort of broader conversations that are going on in terms of whether it's abolition or imperial politics, etc. There's this sphere of Black resistance that is there, that is not autonomous so much as that it is distinct and unique and has its own logic, right? And I was just wondering if you would talk more about that, because I really found that fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's something that, I think like Manuel, I'm not necessarily an expert in this area. It's some new research that kind of been putting together. But I think it is interesting because you do have a political realm that's, as I was saying, sort of very well established, well sort of meant to exclude not just people of color, but not also to include all whites. We think about a way in which the Petit Blanc, Grand Blanc, in Saint-Domingue and so on, and ways in which even sort of some whites were excluded from the political realm. And I think you have a system like that that begins to get significantly challenged, particularly in the late 18th century in this kind of revolutionary moment. And a way in which, sort of several people of color start to take advantage of that. And I think about in the early 18th century, you have some free people of color taking advantage of private bills or sort of legislation petitions that they send into the legislative assembly, the colonial assembly, and they petition for certain privileges, sort of white privileges, and they kind of know how to to work around the system. Very few people actually gain those privileges. I think in the extent of the whole 18th century, there are probably 4 of those passed. So very kind of limited access in that way. But then when we do think about this issue of societies, of collective action in a range of ways, these sorts of clubs, and I think there's perhaps more research that can be done, because we can think about we have Bookman and all these sorts of like secret societies and religious societies and so on, as a kind of separate and distinct, as you say, kind of public sphere, realm of kind of Black politics emerging, because oftentimes, they may be meeting for particular purposes, but, just in the same way that you have the kind of gentleman clubs for planters and so on, and they're talking politics. They're talking about how to, to lobby against sort of major decisions that influence their sort of their own preferences, so to speak. I think there's a level of that happening. Certainly more so in among sort of free people of color and the societies that they emerge. And I think there's more research that has to be done. Like, there has to be a link. In 1792, when free people of color gain rights, full political rights, in that same year, you have a major petition that emerges in Jamaica as well. So there's some level of sort of, networks that I think there needs to be more research being done. I know of William Dowding, who is a free colored man born in Barbados, I think, and who sort of traveled across the Eastern Caribbean. And there's more research that could be done in this area. And I know that he's sort of, almost kind of lobbying for free people of color. I think he writes a letter to, I'm mixing up my information here, but he sends a letter to the United States, the president at the time. Just sort of, that's, I wish I remember the specific reference to that, but it's in James Epstein's Scandal of Colonial Rule. There's a book there, he talks a little bit about that. But these sort of free colored networks that are emerging, and I think there should be sort of more research being done. And we could think of, Julia Scott, right? The Common Wind and those things as well. I think are particularly relevant. There's certainly a lot more research that can be done. And then thinking about sort of maroon societies and, the way in which they sort of elect their own leaders. And, so I think there is this sort of distinct kind of Black political realm that can be, that can be sort of emphasized during this period of slavery. And we're talking about the late 18th century, but we're curious to kind of explore that in much earlier periods as well, I think. So I think that's an interesting question.
I actually had a question for that, so I'm going to jump in, but also anyone else in the audience or also on the panel have any questions, feel free to jump in as well. But relating to this idea, I think that, for all of like the sort of ideas that you're talking about, or even the people and the movements that they were a part of, there's an element of trying to recover these histories, because they're not, the histories of like just, the rebellions that are well documented, or even, the people that are well documented in the historiography, and, we don't have access, or the same level of ease of access that we have to, archival material, for, which leads to, dominance in certain historiographical trends. So I'm wondering, what goes into producing the research? I can't say, with like, how do you research the histories of, like, very personal instances of enslaved women resisting their conditions, or nonviolent resistance, collective nonviolent resistance, maybe conspiracies that didn't, like, ever come under, like, any sort of like state surveillance. If you could talk a bit more into the process that goes into doing this history, I think that would be really interesting.
So that's a great question, Shruti. I think anyone writing histories of the disfranchised who do not leave huge amounts of archival material or manuscript collections or print culture is always a challenge. And this is what historians have commonly called, the silence of the archives when it comes to particular subjects. And I think there are ways in which not only do we have to develop new methodologies, new methods in terms of historical method of recovering. So a lot of the instances of enslaved women's resistance that you talked about actually come from slaveholders' papers. But it's also how you reread or interrogate or read between the lines of dominant, sources. So I found that when I was writing my book on abolition that, luckily there is this big project called the Black Abolitionist Papers that was ongoing from the 1990s. So, first it was published in volumes and then in microfilm, and then it was digitized, and I read all versions of it. What was interesting for me was to actually go back into that abolitionist print culture and look at Black print culture, which really, as Drexel was kind of a counter public to the dominant public, public sphere. And so just doing that, I discovered so much more. At least in the US, there was a lot of instances. And now I know also in the Caribbean, there's so many, the newspapers and others that, are free Blacks and that scholars have written about. But just going back to those original sources was really important, and rereading them. And I think a lot of historians are doing that, like Brooke Newman does it, I think, in her new book. Others do it. So Sasha Turner, I think, particularly the issues that you're interested in, does it. So I think it is important to go back to those colonial records. But I found a lot of African-American voices in abolitionist print culture. They're publishing. So you think, oh, here's someone, she or he didn't publish anything. And then, I read, issues of the Liberator, and they have long essays and letters and, a huge amount that you can tell about them. So for me, looking at abolitionist print culture was important. But in terms of, enslaved resistance, I think we have to go back sometimes to our traditional records, even, slaveholders, plantation records, colonial records, and reread them and read them anew. I think a lot of people do that. I think Vince Brown has done that quite a bit now with his new book. So yeah, and Manuel certainly is well versed in doing that. So, and I think Gerard, to a certain extent, probably do it. Others might have other takes on it, but this is, I think, a problem that most African Americanists have when you're writing. Is you have to be mindful because it's very easy then to fall back to the mainstream narrative if you're not.
One of the things that we found, that we have a particular problem when we're thinking of the Underground Railroad, because obviously it was clandestine, right? So there's not going to be a great deal of information given readily, right? And we have in Frederick Douglass's text saying, I'm not going to say anything about it because this will get people into trouble, right? So we have that. So basically we have a sort of a list of sites that have been documented. Then we have sites that are rumored. Then we have sites that are, so what is the relationship between, those as you think about them? And, you know, in the case of the Underground Railroad station that we have here in Ithaca, there is a church we know documented. It was visited by Frederick Douglass. He gave a speech there, documented that it was visited by Harriet Tubman. But the church leadership, which is, you know, the Freedom, the AME Zion denomination, called the Freedom Church, you know, in the 19th century, they still wanted to know if there was the rumor of the tunnel was true. So, you know, I had a geophysicist come in to do a ground penetrating radar. We found some anomalies. Can't give you more information than that. But but at the same time, it still is the relationship between, you know, the documentation and then these other things that fire up the imagination of the people living in the region, right? Especially those who live in Quaker homes, who can show you the attics, you know, the hiding places that are there. And so there are many people who are sort of more on the public historian side, and county historians, you know, town historians that could give information about rumored sites. But at the same time, it's, you know, people might have the documentation, but what sort of, for use, I don't know what the term would be, a sort of a historical imagination that comes about just on the basis of the rumor or the possibility. So, you know, in my case, I've had the students turn to doing creative writing of the experience of somebody going through the Underground Railroad at a particular point, but based off of reading the classic slave narratives plus the history of the Underground Railroad. You know, so it's the only way that we can get closer to sort of, you know, empathizing with that experience, because it seems to be that's what, you know, people outside of the documentation, you know, don't have access to the documentation are interested in. That's the phenomenon.
Manuel, Dexel, any words of advice?
I don't know. I agree with what's been said before, and this idea of having to go back to sources and read against the grain. I will just quickly say, I mean, we have sort of digital history methods just now where that you can kind of, you know, with different sort of keyword searches and pick up on trails of, you know, individuals across, you know, not just sort of plantation records, but whether there's snippets in newspapers and, you know, other sort of databases across the board. That allows us to kind of piece together even more than we would in previous times. I think that's also a sort of benefit, even though there are all sorts of caveats that come with that as well in terms of contextualization and so on. But I think that's also a way in which we can kind of get at the enfranchised. But Manuel.
I just want to say one thing that I tend to talk about this all the time, so you have to forgive me. And you brought up Vincent Brown. We are actually working on a paper together at the moment, and Vincent has discussed this idea of the slave war, and actually a few years ago I was actually working on the same thing, and how forms of African warfare were taken to places like Brazil and Cuba. I published a book on that in 2014. But the reason I'm mentioning this is not because I'm working with Vincent. It's because this issue with reading the sources, and I know I may sound very, I don't even know what the word for that is. I sometimes become repetitive with this, but it's not just reading the sources against the grain or between the lines, and which is fine. I think that we have to do it. This is an absolute must for all of us. But I think that we are all of us, that to a certain extent we are we carry a weight in our shoulders, which is something that some scholars have referred to as the Western gaze, the way in which we look at the world, not just history, not just the way we read the sources. We have been brought up in what we refer to as Western societies, and when we try to read, interpret, understand sources that pertain non-Western peoples, we are still thinking with this Western mentality. We are using Western concepts, Western terminology. It sometimes doesn't apply. Sometimes doesn't really do justice to these men, women, and children we are trying to bring back somehow. So I really think that this is important. And the reason I mention this is because when I was working for this book, I realized that Africans, all the Africans that were interrogated by Brazilian and Spanish prosecutors in both countries, they were being led by these prosecutors, and they would tell them, why did you rebel? Why did you decide to go into an insurrection? And the reply would always be, I went to war because. I decided to go to war because. They use the term war, and translate it obviously from languages like Hausa or Yoruba, but even when led, they were still trying to convey their own vision of what is that they were doing. And of course, for the oppressors, they were rebelling against the system. But for them, many of them, they were prisoners of war. Maybe they didn't even see themselves as slaves. Maybe they saw themselves as prisoners of war. They have been captured in Africa in a war against another African, not against a white man, by the way. The white man never beat the African in the battlefield, not in that time. And why not take arms on the other side of the Atlantic? You know, it's really very straightforward. Sorry about that. It's a rant, bit of a rant.
No, but thank you for that. That was that's very true, obviously, and especially like, you know, on a talk about decolonization, that is something that we should definitely pay attention to. I think Alice Hank said that she had a question, to do like philosophical question about this. So go for it, Alice.
Thanks. I suppose this, is kind of tying in part of why we were running the series, and this question came up for me when people were talking about recovery and historical method and what that means in different cultures. So I do philosophy, but I do like Indian philosophy, or more like Buddhist philosophy. We talk about like transformation of concepts, and that's used a lot. Or I'm interested in how it's used in like revolutionary thought and pedagogy and that radical tradition. And so my question was just addressed, but I'm wondering as well if anyone has anything to add on like purpose in telling. So like a lot of philosophy, I was going to ask about motives, about what you're doing when you're telling history, because you might say there's no quote unquote historical truth, but you've got to tell something or retell something and you have a motive. But if you're retelling something in philosophy, you need often to transform your understanding of language and social categories, especially if you're trying to teach something different to a particular narrative. And I was wondering, as historians participating in hopefully transformational, like across the board narratives, how you go about that with different conceptions of history or evidence and rereading. And if you could just, because I mean, you just addressed that, but I'm curious across the board on how this weights like responsibility and motivations in your words and particular strategies for doing that. Thanks.
I can take this one. This is a discussion we had about 1.5 or 2 weeks ago in Twitter, actually. Quite a few of us were wondering, why are we doing this? Because it is the quintessential question, you know. We are doing something that we like doing. For me, for instance, teaching is very rewarding. And I have found that admin also is rewarding, funny enough. I never thought I would say that word. But I think that doing research and reading the sources and then writing these stories, we are really, all we do as historians is retell the stories. We bring new evidence, we find new evidence in the sources, in documents, and we retell we tell a story for the first time. Very often we tell a story from the first time, or we identify gaps or identify problems with the state of the field or the kind of knowledge we have about a specific issue, and we try to address them. But philosophically speaking, the reason why we do this, I think that you will find that every historian is going to give you a different answer. For me, particularly, it was very much about, the way I see it, is about bringing back people from the past, from the grave, if you want, or whatever you want. I was joking about Frederick Douglass before, but I kind of try to look at history in that way, very interactive, many of the people that I have reading about were people who were disenfranchised, or they were put in desperate situations by the situations they found themselves. And most of them, actually, their experiences were never recorded before. Even though I'm talking about things that people know about, the specific life stories of specific moments in the lives of these people, they only survive in documents. So it's kind of a duty as well to do justice to these people. That's what I was insisting before about the role of language. I think the language is really, really important, and how we, the language actually gives you a perspective of things as well. And if we are not able to try to understand how these people speak, or how these people also see the world, to a certain extent, we also fail.
Yeah, I think I can just quickly jump off that to think about. No, I mean, I know for me, I'm particularly motivated by the way in which history can sort of be used as a tool for to motivate, to encourage, to, you know, I think about, say, the historian Eric Williams, and very much the writing, coming period of sort of decolonization, and sort of he was sort of a politician, scholar, activist of sorts. And yeah, a way in which you write to sort of motivate people, these sort of disenfranchised people. When we think about traditional narratives of slavery and so on, and newer sort of revisionist work that talk about sort of entrepreneurial skills of enslaved persons, or enslaved persons as captains, or as another side of the story as well that has not been sort of, just as Manuel was just saying, been highlighted. And so part of what we do is to sort of bring out stories that have not been told, and a way in which they can sort of have a very current consequence of where we can kind of sort of motivate and encourage people today, I think is significant. That's a key motive for me.
I'll just add, I'm not coming out of the field of history. I come out of the field of literary criticism, and the reference to the Underground Railroad has been, the project is one in which I can't even begin to retell, because we don't have the telling of the experience of what it was like to go through the Underground Railroad, right? We don't have that. We have, access to information around it by people who participated in the vigilance committees, which were so important for the Underground Railroad, right? We have all of that information, but to have, sort of narratives talking about the actual going through the Underground Railroad, we don't have enough of these to get a sense of it. So in a sense, it's a bit impossible. I cannot use that as documentation. So what do I have? Partly, yes, I've asked archaeologists to come in, because they can provide a kind of historical archaeology depending on the objects that they find, or fragments of objects at the excavation site. So that would be part of the story that could be pieced together. But the other part of it is, daring to speculate in a way that is both from, actually visiting the site myself. So there's a tendency to use an eye, but that, as far as I'm concerned, has to be informed by having, done the reading of whatever the archive is able to give to you. So I just can't, because it's not totally a creative writing project, but I have to sort of position myself, that I, as being informed by historical archaeology plus what are available in the archives, and then sort of daring to imagine what that experience would have been like, And again, what makes it difficult is because it's an exercise in empathy, right? And so, which philosophically is one, would be of interest. How do you do that, when we very well know that we could never put ourselves completely in the shoes of the other, So the retelling, I'm just right interested now in the telling, because I don't know how else, to approach this.
Thank you, all of you, for that answer. But Gerard, what you're saying, I mean, I think Manuel and Dexam both focus on these ideas of telling stories, and history, as much as it, there's a lot of emphasis on empiricism and evidence and all of that. There are also, new methods of doing history, and a lot of them, we're still learning oral histories. A lot of gender history actually relies on very different methods to, political, economic histories. And I think, like, I mean, at least I find in my essays that I've been doing this term, one of my essays was entirely based on, basically doing literary criticism of party manifestos. So I find it to be like an immensely helpful tool to look at it that way. And also, so much of history are just creation of narratives more than, like, I guess, historical truth, like Alice is talking about. But I recognize we are past time, but thank you so much for this amazing conversation. It was lovely to meet you all and talk to you and learn from you. This was great.
Thank you all too. It's been